Volume 1, Chapter 5 of The Female American, or The Adventures of Unca Eliza Winkfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 5. She offers up praise to God, takes refuge in a hermitage, where she finds a manuscript left by the deceased inhabitant, in which are instructions how to subsist on the island, reflections on her situation. Thus, disconsolate and alone, I sat on the seashore. My grief was too great for my spirits to bear. I sunk in a swoon on the ground. How long I lay in this senseless state I know not, or whether I might ever have recovered, had not a wave, brought on by the rising tide, and which broke over me, awaked me. I arose, hardly sensible where I was, or what I was doing, and ran to a rising ground. And here I once again beheld my deplorable condition. A few minutes' recollection brought me to a sense of my duty, for reflecting within my mind that as the wicked captain could very easily have killed or drowned me, it was a wonder that he should give me the least chance for life, that I ought therefore to thank God for this escape, and to commit myself to his providence. Indeed, in the hour of affliction we are ready enough to pray to God for help, but are so taken up with a sense of our miseries that we forget that we have any mercy to be thankful for. We should always sing a Te Deum before we sigh a litany, for our sighs will sink before they reach heaven, unless raised thither by the wind of praise. Filled with these ideas, I fell on my knees and thanked God, who had delivered me out of the hand of the wicked, and that now I was in his only. On this occasion, these words of David came into my mind. Let me now fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercies are great, and let me not fall into the hands of man. At the close of my prayers, I solemnly committed myself into the hands of God. I now arose from my knees with a serenity by no means to have been expected. During this composure of mind, I advanced to the highest ground I could see, in hopes I might discover some place of safety, not considering the improbability of such a discovery. Though the sun shone very hot, which soon dried my wet clothes, yet I saw it declining apace. I therefore kept looking about with eager expectation, when at last I saw, or thought I did, the ruins of a building. I advanced and saw it more distinctly. Though it promised what I wished for, an asylum, yet I dreaded to go nearer. I looked, I stopped, I prayed, and then I moved again. Thus, strangely divided between hope and fear, I still kept going forward, and in an inexpressible agitation got close up to it, almost insensibly. I was so near now as to perceive a door half open. I listened and heard no noise. Fearful to retire or to enter, I stood trembling a long time. How long I might have remained in this condition I know not, had not a sudden noise behind me, like the hallooing of a human voice, forced me precipitately to rush in, fearless of the danger within, that I might avoid that which threatened me from without. This double sense of danger deprived me of my senses, and I sunk down in a swoon. As I recovered by degrees, I saw all within the apartment before I was quite sensible enough to be afraid of my situation, and seeing nothing to alarm, I grew quite calm, and observing a kind of great chair, formed of several large and less stones, and the seat covered with a great heap of leaves, I sat down, and rested my weary limbs and agitated spirits. The sun still shone pretty bright through the holes in the wall, which was of stone, and perfectly discovered everything within. My fright had deprived me of the thought to shut the door. However, nothing came to hurt or alarm me. Before me was a heap of stones, on which laid a grater, which served as a table, and near enough to lean on. In a large fish shell that lay on the table, I perceived water, which I boldly ventured to drink of, and found myself instantly refreshed. I lifted up my heart to heaven with thanks, and bespoke its further protection. On my right hand I saw a kind of couch formed, like a table, of a heap of stones, and the flat part, or surface, covered with moss and leaves. I now concluded that this was the habitation of some human being, but this gave me no alarm, for as I had read of hermits who frequently retire from public life to enjoy their devotions in private, I imagined, from what I saw, that this must be the habitation of such a one, from whom I did not doubt but I should meet with protection and spiritual consolation. This reflection restored me to such tranquillity of mind that I rested myself with the pleasing expectation of his return, which, considering it was near night, I thought could not be long. As I now had fresh cause to be thankful, I was so, and found I had spirits enough to sing a short Latin hymn of praise. But still no hermit appeared, and the sun was now set, but the moon was risen and shone with so much brightness into the cell that I scarcely missed the greater luminary. As I thus sat waiting, I observed a book lying on the table, which I had not before perceived, which I supposed to be a book of devotion, but on opening it, found it to be a manuscript, in the first leaf of which were these words: "If this book should ever fall into the hands of any person, it is to inform him that I lived on this uninhabited island 40 years. But now, finding the symptoms of death upon me, I am going to retire to another stone room, where I shall lay me down, and if God pleases, rest forever from all my troubles." As this was dated as to the month and year, though without day of the month, I concluded he must be dead, as it was a month ago, and therefore gave over all expectation of seeing the hermit, with the thought of whose presence I had pleased myself. A little lower in the same page was added, "If thou shouldest be obliged to stay here any time, there are no wild beasts or noxious animals to injure thee, nor savages, except once a year, on one day, see page of this book, 397. How you may subsist, you may learn from the history of my life." I immediately turned to the page referred to, and found that it was yet 2 months to the time of the Indians coming on this island. I now thought I might sleep securely. I therefore shut the door and fastened it with a heavy stone that lay there, I supposed, for that use. Coming back from the door, I spied a heap of Indian roots, which I presently knew to be such, and which serve instead of bread. As some of them were yet very good, and had been roasted, being very hungry, I ate heartily and drank more of the water. As I walked about the room, I saw in a nook another shell, which I imagined to be filled with the juice of wild grapes, from the look and taste, and therefore, as I was faint, drank some of it, but with caution, as I found it was grown strong withstanding. As the moon shone very bright, I took out my Greek Testament, which I always carried in my pocket, it being my custom to read a chapter in it morning and night. I opened accidentally to the Epistle of the Hebrews, and the first words that offered to my view were these: Chapter 8, Umese ano oud omese enkada lipo. I cannot but say they gave me great comfort, and I thought myself in that moment equal to all the difficulties I foresaw I had to encounter with, through the divine protection, though I very well remembered the caution my pious and judicious uncle gave me. "Beware," said he, "of the practice of some enthusiasts of our times, who make the word of God literally an oracle, by opening of it at particular times and on particular occasions, presuming that wherever they open, they are to apply the passage to themselves, or to the business they are about, because many have thereby been led into spiritual pride, and others into despair, as they opened on a promise or a curse, whilst others have but too often, in the same manner, pleaded a warrant from Scripture to perpetuate wickedness or to propagate error. Though," added he, "happy is the Christian who, by a prudent and rational use of the Scriptures, procures comfort to his soul. For as the Apostle says, whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. Romans chapter 15, verse 4. Having read the whole chapter and said my prayers, I prepared to take my rest on the stone couch, and laid down in my clothes, with more composure, notwithstanding my dreadful situation, than my wicked captain, I think, could do, though indeed, I believe, a man may sin to such a degree as to render his conscience quite callous, the most dreadful state a human being can sink into. Sleep soon closed my eyes, and I did not awaken till the sun was up. My spirits cheered by such timely refreshment, and my devotions performed, I quitted my cell and directed my feet towards the seashore, to see what was become of my chest that I had left there the preceding night, little expecting to see it again, because I thought the working of the tide must have washed it into the sea, or have buried it in the sands. After some search, I spied it almost buried indeed in the sands, but was not much better for the discovery, as I was unable to remove it. I therefore returned to my cell, ate some of the Indian roots, and drank a little water, whilst my mind was busied, how I should break open my chest, and so bring away at times what I could not at once. I had indeed a small knife in my pocket, but that was not strong enough to cut through a thick board. I looked round my cell, and found nothing that could assist me. This gave me some concern, for if I could not come at my clothes, I considered that I should soon be very uneasy to myself, and started at the thoughts of going naked. However, for the present, I was obliged to be contented. But now other cares came into my mind. The roots I fed on were not all of them good, but only a few of them so, and how was I to get more? I did suppose they grew in the island, but I was not fond of rambling. Though the hermit's manuscript assured me there were no inhabitants nor animals to hurt me, yet the thought of wandering alone was terrifying. I might lose my way and not be able to find my cell again, or not under a long time, and even should I find plants near my habitation, how was I to make a fire to roast them? Other anxious thoughts still pressed upon my mind, one after another. At last I recollected that in the memorandum I had read the night before, I was informed that the hermit's manuscript contained instructions how to subsist. This once more cheered my mind, and I now began to give it a careful reading, but not regularly, impatiently looking here and there for those things that most concerned me. It was written in a fair, legible hand. I soon found that there was a flint and steel in the cell I was in, that at some distance there was a small river that ran quite through the island, that he made use of the shell of a certain fish for a lamp, in which he burned the fat of goats, and for a wick made use of a particular reed. I then searched to learn how he got goats to supply him with fat, and at last met with this memorandum. When I first came upon this island, I found plenty of goats, yet having no firearms, I was never the better for the discovery, as they were too wild to catch. But observing that they were very fond of a yellow fruit that grows on several of the trees here, and that they were continually watching when any of it fell off to eat it, this suggested a thought, that if I gathered some of it, I might possibly tame them by giving them plenty of it to eat. I accordingly broke down some of the branches, and whilst I held them in my hand, they would follow me up and down like a dog, so that I could catch them when I pleased. I found also that the goats, if I laid plenty of this fruit before them, would let me milk them whilst they fed. I from this time no more wanted either milk or goat's flesh, for as I knew this fruit would not be on the trees all the year, I gathered large quantities of it in the season, and saved them to serve in the other part of the year. This information gave me great pleasure. I immediately searched and found the steel and flint, and near them dry leaves and touchwood. I now thought of setting fire to one end of my box, as thinking it better to burn part of my clothes than come at none of them. But, however, I declined this method in hopes of finding some better expedient, but was still very uneasy, lest the tide should remove it into the sea, or bury it out of sight in the sands. But I was obliged to run every risk. A few days afterwards, what I wished for was effected by a means that I at first thought would have entirely deprived me of my chest. I was walking near the seaside, looking at my chest, when I observed the sea to rise, and presently the winds blew very tempestuously. I retreated back enough to observe the storm in safety, which at last became very great, and soon saw my chest tossed about by the waves, as though it had been as light as a feather. I expected that every fresh wave would remove it forever out of my sight, but it was removed further and further on shore, as the sea advanced, till at last I saw it no more. I then gave it up for lost, and returned home, for so I now called my cell, very uneasy. However, the next day, the storm being over the night before, and the sun shining very bright, I again visited the shore, and the spot where the chest had lain, but in vain. But seeing at a distance higher up from the shore some rocks, my curiosity led me to go up to them, not with any expectation of finding my chest, for I had given over all thoughts of it. But climbing up one of them, I found my chest lodged there. I was glad to see it, though the same difficulty still remained, how to open it. Being weary with climbing the rock, I sat myself down to rest. As I was sitting on that side of the rock that declined to the sea, I observed that on the other side of the rock was a very deep descent, at the bottom of which were craggy stones, but level with the rest of the island. I was startled at my nearness to it. However, this suggested something to my mind. If, thought I could push the chest down this precipice, the fall might break it. At least it would be out of the reach of the sea. However, I was afraid to do so, lest I should tumble over with it. But after some consideration, I thought that if I laid myself down on the ground, on the side on which I got up, I might attempt it. I accordingly tried, and with great difficulty moved it, but not immediately. At last, after a great deal of labor, it fell over. The noise it made when it came to the ground frightened me, though I knew what it was. My next business was to get down the way I came up, and then to find my way to the valley. I did so, but was obliged to go a great deal about. When I was come near to the spot, I found the ground so rugged that it was with great difficulty, and not without several falls, that I reached the chest, which I found broke into a great many pieces, and it took me up near a whole day to remove the contents, gowns, linen, and many other useful things. All these I conveyed to my cell, not a little pleased that I had at last conquered this great difficulty, and was now supplied with things that I should have greatly wanted. But to return to where I left off. Having found the steel and flint, I immediately made a trial of them, and they were in very good order. I found 3 lamp shells ready prepared. I lighted them, and they burnt very well. My next attempt was to get some goat's milk, as I had yet tasted nothing but roasted roots and water. I took a large fish shell, of which I found plenty ready at my hand. It was not long before I met with the tree with the yellow fruit, and several goats under it, who ran a little way off as I advanced, but not out of sight, but seemed to wait as if they watched me. I found it very difficult to climb the tree, but at last got up and broke several boughs off, and as soon as I was down, the goats came to me. I laid the boughs down and clapped my foot on them, lest the goats should drag them away. I now tried to milk one of them, but very awkwardly, having never done so before. However, I got enough to drink then, and to bring home for another time. I repeated this practice till I became very ready at it, and not knowing how soon the fruit might fail, I took care to gather and save a good deal of it. My next attempt was to kill a goat, as I found I grew weak for want of more substantial food than plants and milk. There was a knife fit for this purpose in my cell, and several others, and forks. But the thoughts of killing shocked me, and I was afraid to kill one whilst the others saw me, lest they should be afraid and shun me for the future. Having therefore thrown down a good deal of the fruit with a bough of it, I enticed one of them to follow me till out of the sight of the others, and then, but with great uneasiness to myself, killed it. But a more difficult task was still behind, to skin and cut it up. But as my time was not very precious, I had enough to bestow on it, and at last completed my job, though in a very bungling manner. I carried it home and made a fire, having plenty of wood, and roasting some of it, I made a hearty, grateful meal. What I could not eat whilst it was fresh, I salted, for I found plenty of salt on the rocks by the seaside. My next care was to provide a new stock of roots, as though I found in the cell were nearly consumed. It was not long before I found plenty. These I roasted on the fire and laid them up. If I was now rich in provisions, I was quickly more so. For almost every day, looking into the hermit's manuscript book, I learned from thence that there was not only plenty of shellfish on the shore, all of them wholesome, except the black flesh kind, but that every tide left great numbers of other fishes in the holes and shallows. I soon tasted some of each sort, and found them very delicious, particularly a shellfish, like what are called oysters in England, and which needed no dressing. Others were of the lobster and crab kind. The shells of the latter, being large, were very useful. Besides fish and flesh, I could also help myself to birds of various kinds, particularly some like larks, which I took according to the hermit's direction in this manner. From several of the trees issued a kind of glutinous matter, which I gathered and besmeared the little low brambles and bushes with it, and by that means catched a great many small birds that used to eat the berries of them. What a plentiful table was here, furnished only at the expense of a little trouble. This happiness I owed to the misfortunes of another, for had not the hermit made these discoveries, and left the means of my coming at the knowledge of them, how miserable must have been the state of a lonely woman. Doubtless I should soon have perished with hunger. How graciously does the goodness of Providence often raise help to the distressed from the misfortunes of others. The hermit who had made these discoveries, and by them was supported, had great reason to thank God, and I no less cause to be thankful to the same being who influenced his heart to leave behind him the history of his life, which proved the preservation of mine. If this reflection gladdened my heart, it was succeeded by one that gave me no less pain. At last, cried I, he died here. What might he not feel for want of some kind friend to ease his sufferings in his last hours? 40 years without human society, no opportunity offered to restore him to his native or to any other country. Must this be my fate? Tears gushed from mine eyes, and sorrow filled my heart. Thus weeping and lamenting I sat, and from time to time exclaimed, Wretched princess, what have I done to suffer thus from human treachery? But at length a more comfortable view of my condition again presented itself to my mind, and I was consoled. For I again reflected on the great improbability that there was of my finding such a resource in my captivity as the hermit's book, and how thankful I ought to be. I will take this, cried I, as an earnest of a future deliverance. At this instance, I experienced such an inward persuasion in my mind that I should escape from this island, that every uneasy thought fled, and left my mind a calm scarcely to be expressed. I therefore arose and went cheerfully about my little concerns, but not without having first thanked that God who had given me this consolation. End of chapter 5.